Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to week number 24 here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge, coming to you from effectively my old stomping ground in Canna Bay, an area within the Victor Harbour region, here to minister at Bayside Church this weekend. Very much looking forward to that. All right, but here we go. Coming to you also here on these video tutorials week after week, no matter where I am in the world, as we walk through the Bible story as best we can in a chronological format. We do find ourselves at times crisscrossing, going a little bit back and forth and repeating some areas, because we're not just reading according to a strict, precise chronology. We are also trying to read whole books at once as best as we can. And so sometimes there's a little bit of overlap there, which again happens this week. Effectively, where we're at in the narrative of God's story or God's journey with his people is that after the people of Israel divided into two kingdoms in 722 BC, the northern kingdom was destroyed and taken away by Assyria, which was a kingdom from further north. Now, of course, this comes as no surprise to us. Moses himself had prophesied and predicted way back at Mount Sinai that if God's people were unfaithful to his covenant law, the Torah, the Ten Commandments and all the other laws, if they were unfaithful to him, then that would result in death, doom and destruction. And of course, it's also not as a surprise to us because there were contemporary prophets. We've already read Isaiah, Micah and Amos last week, who were within the decades around this destruction, were all prophesying Israel up the north, Samaria, Ephraim, as otherwise known as, you're about to be destroyed because you've disobeyed God and have been unloyal to his covenant. Well, this week we read a fourth contemporary prophet around this period of time, and his name is Hosea, who likewise foretold this destruction, but does so in a very, very unique way. So I want to talk about Hosea a bit, mention a little bit more about Isaiah, because we're reading quite a few chapters from him today, as well as a couple of Psalms. That's what's coming up this week. All right, so let's go. Hosea is basically, as I understand it, the only prophet that comes from the northern kingdom. Last week, Amos and Micah, for example, are boys from the south. They're from the Judah area, even though they spoke to their audience was the northern kingdom, where Hosea himself is a local. He's from the northern kingdom, and he's also known as the most major of the minor prophets. Now, what we call the major and minor prophets are essentially only based on how big their books are, okay? So it's not that big a deal. Just because these guys that we've been reading have been minor prophets, it's only because their books are small. No big deal. Well, Hosea is the biggest of the smallest guys, okay? And again, he does what we saw Micah and Amos do last week. He describes very much what is happening in the destruction of the northern kingdom, what is happening behind the scenes. He uses covenant language, spiritual language, and in particular covenant language. What distinguishes Hosea is he uses this week the language of marriage covenant. Okay, what's happening in the north to the northern kingdom is not just death, doom and destruction because they've disobeyed God's law. No. Hosea tells us that God's people are actually God's wife. And by committing idolatry, worshipping other gods, God's wife is actually committing adultery. Okay, idolatry is adultery. And like any adulterous woman, if you read back in the law, okay, there are two repercussions of that sin that the Torah demands, or at least the Torah allows for: her death and her divorce. Well, this is the message of Hosea. Hosea is basically the first prophet we've seen to overtly describe God's people in this way, that the covenant they entered into at Sinai was like a marriage covenant. Now, as you sort of think back, you think, oh yeah, there might have been signs of that in Song of Solomon's maybe, or even in Moses, the language of marriage came out. But Hosea is the very first one to strictly and overtly say, you, my people, God's people, are his bride, and you've been unfaithful to him. He won't be the last to do it. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel will later echo what Hosea says, but he carries a very specific message about God's people being his bride. And incidentally, if you want to, head over to my YouTube. Well, you're on my YouTube now, many of you, but I actually preached a message some time ago on God's three brides, where I bring out Hosea and other prophets that speak about God's people being his bride. If you think God's three brides, what the heck does that mean? You just have to watch that video, okay? It's the famous one, some of you may know it, where I use the Barbie dolls to explain the history of God's marriage covenant with his people, okay? But the point being, God's people in the northern kingdom specifically, that's who Hosea is directing, have committed adultery on him. And so God comes and he says, listen, Hosea, I want you to demonstrate what I'm going to do to the northern kingdom by overseeing their death and by overseeing their divorce. All right? And basically all this is summed up in the first 3 chapters of the book. You have to read Hosea 1, 2, and 3 all together. The remaining chapters are all poetry, prophetic poetry that sort of come and go. There's a whole number of poems in there. But the first 3 chapters are basically a summation of the whole story. Hosea marries an unfaithful woman. They have children, okay, which he calls not my people and not my loved one, okay, very scathing names to illustrate this point. But then later in the piece, Hosea remarries this unfaithful bride. And so we see this fantastic thing that we're seeing all the way through the prophets, and we'll continue to see that while most of the prophets in the Old Covenant are doom and gloom, there's always hints of hope. Okay, so why Hosea sends his wife away, just like God is going to send the northern kingdom away, there are hints of hope. All right, that there is a future restoration coming. But what I really want you to pay attention to in Hosea this week is the language. Again, as we've often seen in the scripture, as you read the narrative, it's very straightforward in how it explains what's happening. But the psalms, the poetry of the prophets, oh, here comes some wind, the prophecy of the poets is very dramatic, it's very exaggerated. So it's not just an army taking Israel away. God is tearing Israel apart like a lion, okay? He is rejecting her. He's no longer loving her. He's driving her away like Cain from the land. Pain, he says, will come to you like a woman in labor. You will cry to the mountains, fall on us because of the judgment that's coming to you. However, there's always hints of hope. Even though I will see them die, he says, I will bring them back to life. Where, O death, is your sting? Where, O death, is your victory? And this will happen in the day where I forgive Israel of their sin. All right? So just as it is with Adam and Eve, on the day they took the fruit, okay, they experienced a relational death and they were cast out of Eden. So it is, as we've seen, with the northern kingdom. However, we are seeing a promise of restoration at some point in the future. Last week, we saw the promise of return to the land. Yes, my people will be taken away, but there will be a return in the future. We also saw that, yes, my people were split into 2 kingdoms, but in the future they will be reunited as one. Well, this week we see in the common theme of restoration, we see that while my people have been killed, covenantally dead, they will be raised to new life. A resurrection is coming. And while I will divorce them, God says, I will remarry them in the future. Now, all these promises of restoration are coming, so take note of that poetic language. All right? Then we head into the book of Isaiah. This is our third of four weeks in Isaiah. We're reading another 21 chapters this week, so it's a big chunk of him. Isaiah is the most major of all the major prophets, okay? So he's a big deal. Last week we saw him prophesy in the north and the destruction there. This week, I hope you can still hear me, it's getting quite windy here. This week we see him prophesying against other nations, Babylon, Moab, Aram, Cush, Tyre and Egypt. We saw him prophesy against them last week. Well, this week he turns his attention again to Jerusalem and Judea down the south. And I highlight this because it's not so obvious in the text. It sounds like in our English translations that he is prophesying over the whole earth. But the word there is the same word used of Abraham when he says, I give you this land. Okay, so don't read global judgments into Isaiah. He's prophesying very specifically against Jerusalem and Judea in the south from around about chapter 24. And this week we see that specifically when the narrative begins in around about chapter 36, when the Assyrian king comes in. Not only he's taken out Israel, but 8 years later he now comes to the south to attack Jerusalem. Well, thanks to the prayers and prophecy of Isaiah and King Hezekiah, who's a good king, the Assyrians go back and don't take out Judea. However, Isaiah predicts the day in the future where they will not be spared, and another kingdom from the north, Babylon, will actually take Jerusalem out. All right. So while Jerusalem is spared from King Sennacherib, from Assyria, well, they won't last long. There is a destruction coming to them, unfortunately, as well. And by the way, next week, we're going to read the narrative of that in Kings and Chronicles. So as I said earlier, a little bit of repetition there, okay? This week, we're also going to be reading Psalm 48 and 76, which speak about the God protecting his city, Jerusalem, but again, only for now, only for now, only for now. Unfortunately, there's bad news coming, as it was in the north, so it will be in the south. However, as it was in the north, a lot of divorce and death and doom and gloom, there are always hints of hope on the mountain of Zion. On the mountain of Zion, in Jerusalem, death will be swallowed up, a feast will be prepared, tears will be wiped away, a shroud will be removed, a trumpet will blast, and the people will gather again to worship God in David's city. All right? Doom and gloom, hints of hope. That's it. That's how the prophets work. Guys, bless your readings. I hope this video's come out okay, and I'll get on with my packed weekend here with the Bayside Church family. I'll see you next week. Bless your heaps.